This is our second lesson on the French Revolution. Last lesson, we covered the three estates: the church, the nobility, and all the rest, the peasants and common people. Those are the three estates. So let's talk about the financial crisis. France had been fighting wars, going into debt. There was a bread price. The price of bread had gone up because of bad weather, and people were now starving. So let's continue. The expenditures France made on the American Revolution, along with the huge sums the king spent to maintain his lavish lifestyle, worsened its already precarious and financial situation. And by the late 1780s, the government lay close to bankruptcy. Louis XVI's finance minister, Swiss banker Jacques Necker, knew that the poor had already been taxed as much as possible, and therefore a new source of revenue had to be found. Necker proposed levying a tax on all property. This essentially meant that the first and second estates, the church and the nobles, would now have to pay taxes. Needless to say, neither of these groups supported this plan. The aristocracy, who saw their exemption from taxation as a birthright, refused to even discuss the issue. The church, which had grown wealthy on taxes and property holdings, also rejected the idea of having to pay taxes on its land. Since the first and second estates had balked at this plan, Necker urged the king to call a meeting of the estates general in order to get the property tax implemented. Each estate had one vote in the estates general, despite the fact that the first and second estates only represented 3% of the population of France. So the third estate gets one vote, but it's 97% of the people. In addition, since the first two estates, the church and the aristocracy, always voted together, if the third estate disagreed with them, there was little it could do with its single vote. When the Estates General convened in Versailles in May 1789, the first and second estates had about 300 delegates each, while the third estate had about 600 delegates. A controversy over voting arose almost immediately, as the third estate demanded that rather than having one vote per estate, each delegate be given a vote. This would have allowed the third estate the opportunity to gain a majority. The king, however, rejected the proposal. After weeks of frustrating debate over voting, the representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly and claimed that they were France's true representative body. They invited members of the other estates to join them, and some members of the clergy and aristocracy did so. The National Assembly was inspired by the influential Abbé Cécile, who had earlier published a pamphlet that proclaimed the Third Estate and the nation were one. Let's discuss this cartoon. It's called The Third Estate Awakens. We see here how the church and the aristocracy look on in horror and suspense at the Third Estate undoing its chains and grasping onto weapons. This is the awakening of the Third Estate, getting off the ground, realizing you do have power. The guns represent the power. Confrontation with the king. Louis XVI ordered that the National Assembly be locked out of its meeting place. He continued to insist that the estates meet separately and that the National Assembly be disbanded. The National Assembly responded by moving to a nearby tennis court, where they vowed not to leave until France had a constitution. This tennis court oath gained the assembly popularity among the working class and the poor. They even drew some of the more open-minded clergy and nobles on their side as well. On June 27th, the king reversed his position and ordered the first two estates to join the National Assembly. He also decided to call French troops into Paris to try to keep a lid on the volatile situation. When rumors spread that the king was amassing troops, rioting started in the streets of Paris. On July 11th, Louise fired Necker, whose advocacy of easing the tax burden on the lower classes had made him quite popular among the Third Estate. Mobs in Paris reacted by seizing weapons from one armory and then attacking the Bastille, a prison and armory that was a prime symbol of royal absolutism. After a furious battle between the crowd and the prison guards, the Bastille fell. French soldiers had refused to stop the attack, a sign that Louise was losing control. After the battle, the mob completely destroyed the Bastille. In the picture you see what the Bastille looks like. It's very fortified. The fall of the Bastille became the main symbol of the revolution. It also marked an end of the king's ability to enforce his authority. The revolution quickly spread to the countryside. Peasants, armed with pitchforks and other rudimentary weapons, overran estates and country houses, seized and destroyed the records. To restore order, the National Assembly abolished feudal privileges on August 4th, thus making all French citizens equal in the eyes of the state. Just as the Declaration of Independence had laid out the ideals of the American Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen set forth the ideals of the French Revolution. Adopted by the new French National Assembly on August 27, 1789, the document embodied the Enlightenment concepts of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and freedom from arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. The first three articles read 1. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. 2. The aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It's a right. Number 3, the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. Article 5 proclaimed limits on government authority, stating that, quote, the law has only the right to forbid those actions that are detrimental to society. Anything that is not forbidden by law may not be prevented, and none may be compelled to do what the law does not require. End quote. Although the Declaration did not create a new constitution, it did create a new government with the king as a figurehead. Sovereignty now lay with the people rather than with the monarch. The principles of the Declaration were most clearly captured in the slogan of the French Revolution, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, which means liberty, equality, fraternity. Though the lower classes undoubtedly endorsed the ideas expressed in the Declaration, the issuing of the document still did not satisfy them, largely because the king refused to accept either the Declaration or the National Assembly's abolition of feudalism. Louise had consequently abandoned Paris and moved to the royal palace of Versailles in order to avoid the turmoil in the city. Meanwhile, by October, food shortages had become critical again. On October 5th, a starving crowd of thousands of women marched on Versailles in order to get the king to accept the National Assembly's measures. By the time they reached the royal palace, the march had become a mob. The National Guard attempted to maintain order, but the mob attacked the palace. Only when the king agreed to return to Paris was some semblance of order restored. Once back in the capital, the king and his family were essentially imprisoned in the Tuileries Palace. They called it the Women's March because it was initially women who led the way. Civil constitution of the clergy. Clergy is the church. Because the French economy still lay in chaos, the National Assembly decided to nationalize all church property and abolish monasteries. The confiscated lands were used as collateral to back paper currency called assignats. The church lands were then sold to bring in much needed revenue. Consequently, many churches were shut down. The church was also secularized and reorganized under a new civil constitution of the clergy. Bishops and priests would be popularly elected, paid by the state, and required to sign an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. The National Assembly's anti church measures caused a rift in French society and alienated a significant portion of the country's population, most of whom were devout Catholics. From this time on, the peasants frequently opposed further revolutionary changes. Here are a couple discussion questions for today.